All right, hello everybody. Picking up with part 2 of our aquatic ecosystem lecture, going over current issues in aquatic natural resource conservation. Our 4 big issues that we're going to cover, maybe not the 4 big issues that your book covers, but the 4 we're going to focus on: groundwater, dams, water redistribution, and just the idea of clean water. And the one common theme among all of these issues is the idea of water availability. So just the idea of water being available to us, or scarcity, the idea that water would not be available to us and would be limited. And all 4 of these issues deal with that same overall idea of water availability or water not being available to us. So the first one, groundwater. Groundwater is one of our most valuable resources. So the empty space in between rocks below the water table are filled up with water. So the upper surface of this wet area is called the water table. So when we talked in the first part about water going into the soil and becoming groundwater, eventually, based on our understanding of soils, you hit bedrock. And once you hit bedrock, you just hit an impermeable rock layer. Nothing goes through it. So what happens is the water goes all the way down through the soil and hits that bedrock, hits that impermeable rock layer, and then it just starts pooling up and puddling up from there. And so that's going to be our zone of saturation, and that's actually going to be our aquifer, our body of permeable rock, which can contain or transmit groundwater. So that's usually that sea layer, our weathered bedrock or parent material layer, because that's got that open space where the water can be in there and flow. And so it hits the bedrock layer and starts to pool up from there. And then, sometimes it'll pull up to the surface, because that's how we get a lake, or that's how we get a stream, is the water table is up above the surface of the land. But most of the time we have the water just down below. And so when we think about that, we want to think about, so why is there a saturated zone and an unsaturated zone? Why is there an area that doesn't have water in it, and why is there an area that does have groundwater in it? And the difference is, in that unsaturated zone, you have organisms, animals, you have roots from plants and trees and shrubs, and you have all these things, and the soil itself, that are going to use and need water. So that area becomes the unsaturated zone, because the water that goes into that area ends up getting used. But you have the saturated zone below that, because eventually you don't have roots, and you don't have animals, and you don't have microorganisms and all these things, and you get to a point where you just can have the groundwater stored up. And so looking at this graphic right here, you can see our unsaturated zone, the upper part, and then you can see the saturated zone, and the water table is going to be that top part of the saturated zone, the level which the groundwater reaches. So if we were to take any spot and to just start digging, once we hit water, that would be the water table. And we can see on the right of this graphic that you have surface water when your water table is up above the surface of the land. So how does an aquifer work? Remember, the aquifer is that permeable body of rock where water flows in. So this kind of helps us to see that hydrologic cycle and see that watershed, or in this case, it looks like a few different watersheds, because you can see where water's flowing to one area in the hills, and then flowing to a different area in the hills, and then but those are all combining into one larger watershed. And you can see some lentic systems, you can see some lakes where the water's not flowing very well, and you can see some lotic systems where you definitely see some rivers, drainages. And you can see all along the bottom here, you also have groundwater going into the soil, and it's going into that usually that sea layer, that parent material layer, and it's going to go as deep as it can go, but eventually it'll hit bedrock, and then it'll just pull up from there. And then what happens, as you can see on the right-hand side of this graphic, is somebody, in order to tap into that groundwater, will put in a well, and the well goes deep enough. And you don't want to put the well at the top of the water table, because if you put a well at the top of the water table, if the water table changes or the level of the water changes, then your well won't get you any water. So you want to make sure to put it deep into the aquifer, so that you can get a constant source of water even when there's not a lot of water in the system, because the water table will fluctuate depending on season, depending on amount of rain, depending on if you had a drought or not, and all those different things. This map right here is an example of all the different aquifers within the United States. So number 10 on the left there, that's our Central Valley Aquifer. So basically all the runoff from all the mountain ranges around us provides the Central Valley with a good amount of groundwater, and that's why a lot of people have settled into this area and used it for farming. But that's also where some of our problems these days come from, because we're so ag heavy that we're having problems with selenium being put into the selenium being in our groundwater. And the only way for selenium to not be in our groundwater is to just not farm. But since that is not that's not kind of in the cards, we need to come up with other solutions in order to try and protect our groundwater. If you watched the soils videos during the previous lecture, you would have heard talk about the Ogallala Aquifer. That's this number 11 right in the middle of the map here in states like Nebraska and Oklahoma and Kansas and parts of New Mexico and Texas, as well as a little bit of Colorado and Wyoming as well. And that's that aquifer that they're worried about drying up really soon because of all the groundwater that's been used for irrigation for farming. Another issue that we have going on currently is dams within the United States. And so with dams, there's good parts to dams and there's bad parts to dams. Good parts, it gives us a consistent water source, it can protect us from flood, and it can provide us with clean energy. The problems with dams is that it does cause ecological disruption in terms of natural migration patterns, and provides a barrier to things like fish and other animals who use the flowing water of a lotic system to go from place to place. And then life expectancy. All dams will die eventually. And so we have to understand and be prepared for all of our dams being problematic. And because of that, that means that there's a potential for catastrophe. So that's a big problem, is that it could be catastrophic because of the amount of water that some of these dams are holding and what they're protecting water from. So in that first con that we talked about is the ecological effect and the harmful effect on the environment. So one way that dams try and mitigate that is through a fish ladder. So that's what you see right here, these steps, this artificial barrier where the fish are they're channeled to this fish barrier and then try and work their way through the fish barrier to then be able to continue on their natural migration patterns. It's not the best way to do it, but right now at least it's some sort of mitigation factor to kind of help the natural environment proceed along. So here's example, kind of another example of just some fish trying to work their way up through the steps of the fish ladder. It's a big problem in the U.S. So currently there's about 75,000 dams in the United States, and by 2020, 85% of all dams will be greater than 50 years old. And so there's over 15,000 of the 75,000 dams, so about 17% are deemed high hazard potential as of a report in 2017. So very soon it's going to be a problem that we're going to have to deal with quite a bit and think about, do we want to keep these dams? Do we want to get rid of these dams? How are we going to deal with it? Is there towns or people in the way that could get hurt. There's a lot to consider with these dams. The most famous dam, probably in my mind, is the Hoover Dam. And so I provided 2 links here about the Hoover Dam and just the creation of the Hoover Dam and what it means and what it took and what goes into it, because it's important just in the kind of the understanding of the American West, and it's also going to be important with our next topic, which is the idea of water redistribution and the Colorado River. And really our focus on water redistribution is how is Southern California able to hold so many people? And the answer lies in the Colorado River for the most part. So the Colorado River's headwaters are up in Rocky Mountain National Park, a place where I worked for a summer, and they're up there on the western side of the park, and that's where it starts, and it works its way all the way down and eventually tries to empty out into the Pacific Ocean and into the Gulf of California. But along the way, everybody in these drier western states wants to use it because it's such a great water source. And so it works its way, I said to the Pacific Ocean and the Gulf of California. It just tries to work its way from its headwaters in Rocky Mountain National Park to the Gulf of California. But you can see on the left here in the upper basin and the lower basin that there's a lot of different tributaries, a lot of different areas, and a lot of different big cities along the way that want to use that water and have it help out their burgeoning populations. So even though it's the Colorado River, if we look on the right here, the majority of water in the Colorado River goes to California and goes to our Southern California population via the Colorado River Aqueduct, which goes through the Hoover Dam and Lake Mead. We can see Colorado gets the next biggest slice, and then after that, Arizona, Utah. We've got Mexico, who gets a good slice of the Colorado River as well, and then Wyoming, New Mexico, and Nevada. But the majority of water from the Colorado River goes to Southern California. And so there's 2 main aqueducts that provide water to Los Angeles and to the Southern California area. So an aqueduct being a series of could be all sorts of combinations of like channels and tubes and all sorts of apparatuses that connect water from one place to another. And so the Colorado River Aqueduct takes it all the way from the headwaters in Rocky Mountain National Park all the way to Los Angeles, and the LA Aqueduct takes water from the Owens Valley in California all the way down to Los Angeles. So I've attached 3 links here, and they're all very important in terms of watching and getting an understanding of what an aqueduct is and how an aqueduct works and why, how water got from where it was to Los Angeles. And so when we look at this idea of water redistribution, so LA gets its water for the most part through the Colorado River Aqueduct, the LA Aqueduct. It gets some water from local supplies, but very little if you watch that video that we just talked about. But the majority comes through that Colorado River Aqueduct. As for the whole state of California, here's all the state's water projects. So aqueducts, lakes, and reservoirs, and you can see all the different places and how far water comes in order to get through California and get to these different areas where it's then used for all these different places like Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco, and then also there's a little link here on the bottom. It doesn't have to do with water, but just the idea that thinking, well, LA pulls its water from other places, so that's not great, but that's just one thing. But LA also produces or takes its energy from somewhere else too, because California doesn't want you using coal energy, but Los Angeles gets a lot of energy production from coal-fired power plants in Utah and in other places that aren't California. So they also get their energy from other places. So looking at LA, so the Department of Water and Power, they manage the water and the power within LA, and MWD here, that's the Municipal Water District. That's the managing body for the Colorado River Aqueduct. So you can see right now in between 2010 and 2014 that over half of the water comes from the Colorado River Aqueduct. What they're trying to do, because they realize the problems that they have, is they see that only 12% of their water comes from local water. And so they're trying to up that in the future to where they can get more water, but then also through conservation and recycling water and stormwater capture and water transfers, which is buying water from other places and having it come to LA. They want to try and reduce their dependence on the Colorado River Aqueduct and kind of cut that in half, basically, is what they're looking to do, that's a good thing. In terms of water conservation overall, just how do we use water here in the United States? We, along with India and China, are the three biggest water users in the world. So India uses the most water in the world, then China, then the United States. And you can see the darker colored on the left, the darker color is the amount of water used for agriculture. The medium blue color, that's what's used in industry, and then the light color, that's what's used domestically. So you can see that it's not domestic water use that's problematic in these areas. There's a lot of water being used for agriculture, especially in India and China. And then in the United States, there's a lot of water being used for agriculture, but even more water being used for industry in the United States. And then you can see overall, you can see the majority of water is used for agriculture when we look at the world overall. But here in the United States, it's actually industry that uses the most water, and then agriculture. So another thing that's important to us is the idea of clean water. And so how do we conserve water and how do we keep it clean? So we had the Clean Water Act of 1972, and the real big trigger point for having this Clean Water Act in 1972 was that the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland caught fire multiple times because of the high amounts of pollution within that water body. And so the Clean Water Act, important things to understand is that it established a basic structure for regulating pollutant discharges into the waters of the United States. It's managed by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and it gave them the teeth to manage this thing, to actually punish people for causing pollution. So it made a point to label two types of pollution. There's point source pollution and non-point source pollution. Point source pollution means that it's unlawful for any person to discharge any pollutant from a point source into navigable waters. And when we say a point source, it's a specific source of pollution. I can look and I say, oh, look, there's my river, and there's a pipe coming from that factory, and it's dumping some brown sludge into the river. It's an obvious, specific source of pollution. It also tried to deal with non-point source pollution because it knows non-point source pollution is a critical issue as well. And that's the idea of like the Mississippi River watershed, where we know that there's pollution happening, but it's happening in all these different places, and it's the combination of all these places doing this pollution that's causing just as much of an issue. One of the big things to understand with the Clean Water Act, though, is it addresses surface waters, and it does not address groundwaters or any issues with groundwater. And so here's an example of a loadic freshwater system. And you can see our point source pollutions, these specific pipes that are dropping water in, or dropping sewage or fertilizer or any of these other toxic waste into the water system. But then also the idea of the barnyard runoff, the cropland runoff of fertilizers and pesticides, and the house there where the persons might be fertilizing their lawn or watering their lawn, and sediment from that lawn is running into the river as well. Those are the non-point source methods of pollution, where we're not sure how much is coming in and we're not sure where it's coming from, but we know it's still a problem, and we know we still have to address it and think about it, because we know that this is all one connected ecosystem, and if we don't try and stop those problems, we're going to cause more and more problems downstream. And you can also get this same idea going all the way back to our ideas of eutrophication, having it be problematic as well in terms of point source and non-point source pollution. So a point source pollution would be phosphorus in detergents, or human sewage, or slaughterhouse, dairy, and creamery waste being put into a lake. But you can also get non-point source pollution like animal manure and commercial fertilizers, and soil erosion, and then nitrogen from rainfall. And it's the combination of all of these things that can go into one of these lakes, cause that eutrophication, cause the algal bloom that covers it up and doesn't allow any sunlight in, and then causes hypoxia because oxygen consumption is exceeding oxygen production, and you can have these problems in a lentic system as well. And so it's really key to understand just the connectedness of everything in an aquatic ecosystem, and how problems in one place will lead to problems in other places, and maybe even a nemesis effect that we're not used to understanding. And so that's it in terms of aquatic ecosystems. And as always with any of these lectures, if you got any questions or anything doesn't make sense, please shoot me an email and let me know.